1. Let's call to order the public meeting of the City of Tallahassee Independent Exit Board and its members present here at City Hall, along with members of the public. Others among the public are also attending this meeting through a digital platform that is accessible at the board's website. With the assistance of the Communications Department and the Information Technology Department, this meeting is live streamed on the Ethics Office webpage, and we are recording it for future reference. There is a delay with the online communications, and we should all be patient. We thank those members of the City of Tallahassee for their support. This moment, please rise for Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call.
Carlos Ray.
Present.
Gwen Graham.
Here.
Brian Smith. Ernie Payne.
Here.
Ruby Barr.
Here.
Kristen Costa.
And Robin Blank.
Here.
Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Boyd. This moment, I'll go over the procedures for public comment and conducting the meeting. Those attending the meeting online, please make sure your microphone is muted. Last week, we asked the public to make a request by email to ethics@talgov.com by 1 p.m. on the day of the meeting. If they wish to speak online on the agenda or non-agenda items, those who have submitted their names will be given a chance to speak as scheduled. For those of you who are present and wish to speak, please complete a request form and forward it to Mr. Floyd, any form you may have to speak publicly. We thank you for your interest. Know that your input is important to us. Has everyone received the agenda and supporting documents?
Yes.
With regard to the agenda or procedures of conducting today's business, are there any questions, concerns? I'll now review the approval, and now seek the approval of the minutes for January 26, 2021. Have everyone had the chance to read the minutes from last meeting? Any questions or concerns? Motion to accept from Mr. Ernie Payne.
Second.
Second by Ms. Barr. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes. This time, we'll go to public comments on agenda items.
And I didn't receive anything by email, but I'm looking on the
We have one here, Mr.
Mr. Sims. Ms. Sims, did you wish to speak at this time on an agenda item? No, just speak quickly.
No. So should
No, it's fine.
yeah. My name is Stanley Sims. I'm at 1320 Avondale Way. I'm here this afternoon. I'm no stranger to this board, but I'm here in reference to agenda item number 8, Whistleblower Protection. And I think that when the citizens of this beloved place that I love voted to establish this board, we wanted a board that will demonstrate protection not for just our good, hardworking city employees, but also our Black small businessmen who desire to do business with the City of Tallahassee. Not only our small minority, which is the new sexy name, communities of color, then they keep calling us so many different names. I don't know if to say, if it's rude to say I'm just black and proud. But there ought to be somewhere where there is protection for our citizens who not do it like I do it and reap repercussions. Because mine is blatant. Just like January 6th, blatant. And I'm asking this board, in times where our nation is such a volatile state, rise to the charge. Relook at this Whistleblower Act and see, does it protect individual citizens who are very vocal here in Tallahassee, who goes against the grain. And in my closing, Mr. Reyes, the reason why, the justification of me asking you all to look into these things, because we have elected officials now that sits on the dais and promotes selected black people who he invites at his house. And you think that does not tie in to funding? You think it's just coincidental that everyone in these commercials are funded by the City of Tallahassee? There should be a disclaimer. Why is it? You know how involved I am in this community. When, and I don't mean that in disrespect, I mean that respectable. If it's fair and open to the public, why is it 16 months I can't get a meeting with the city manager? These are the things. I've borne my burdens in the heat of the day, but no one else should. And I'm asking you to look at the Whistleblower Act, that it protects citizens who have demonstrated and have clear evidence that they have been ostracized, blackballed, or given higher standards or false promises. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Chairman, I will check online. I didn't receive any emails, but Mr. Bassine, did you have a comment for the non-agenda items?
I do not today.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Tolman?
No, thank you.
All right.
I don't have any comments for the agenda items at this
All
time.
right, want to make sure. Thank you. And there is one other person, I don't see a name. Might be Ms. Willard. Okay, I see what it is. Ms. Wells, do you have any comment for the agenda items?
No comments, thank you.
All right, thank you all.
Mr. Floyd,
Yes.
will there be an opportunity to speak on the agenda item at the time, or?
Yes, I expect.
Okay. Yes, I thought you might have a question, so I'll save it for then. Thank you.
All right, sure.
We're on to 6,
Yes,
office
sir.
report.
Yes, sir. And this is the Ethics Office report. You received the summary from me. There are a number of things, and I was looking, but I've looked at this in a while to see if there's anything that really stands out, but you see the routine things that we've done. We made a presentation the ethics code and public records law during the internship orientation. We go weekly meetings with the chair. We're doing a literature review on ethics training, and we'll be holding workshops soon. And a number of other functions that we jointly carry out day to day. And I would just ask if you have any questions concerning anything in the memo. If not, I also attached Peter Bussing requested at the last meeting that we get the opportunity to review his letter. So I attached that to make sure you saw it. And I also attached, just for point of reference, it's just a sheet that shows the steps we go into preparing for the meetings, and these kind of things that we're trying to put in place so we do a better job of communicating. And then you have the budget. Do you have any questions regarding the budget? And
I did have one question.
Sure.
There's a line item for minutes for legal services.
Yeah.
There's still, I thought the case was dismissed, right?
Yeah, I think we just received one more bill, and so we're just closing out that.
Nothing further.
Correct. Correct. That is correct, John. Yes. Good question. I didn't have any tracking, any complaints for the monthly tracking. There was one I was supposed to report that but I'll include that in the next meeting. Make sure the public sees it. And that's my report.
Any questions or concerns of the office report?
Thank you.
Sure. If not, we'll move on to agenda item number 7. Right. John.
Okay, and 7A, we've had discussions about what kind of options are available to you as members of the board and how things should function. So I thought I would kind of walk through the process a little bit so we can have some open discussion on what options are available to you at different points of the process. And the other part is just to make sure that when I'm determining legal sufficiency, it's in accordance with how you would wish for me to do that. So as to make sure we're because when I'm determining legal sufficiency and when you're determining legal sufficiency for self-initiated complaints, the process should be the same. And it shouldn't be any different. So what this attempts to do is give you a perspective, at least from my point of view, on how I see legal sufficiency. And I give you 2 scenarios, and these are actually scenarios I use in training. And in the first scenario, you see where Mary, and this is real stuff, Mary works for the city, and hurricane comes through or strong storms and knock down limbs, and the city hires somebody to go out and cut down limbs. She comes out and speaks to him and nicely asks him to cut down a limb that's not included in the city services, and he does that as a favor to her and charges it to the city. And so you're looking at that and you're saying, is it legally sufficient? And the exercise that I go through is I simply look at the elements in the ordinance. So we're looking at misuse of position. And when you look at it, it says no public official or employee of the city shall use or attempt to use his or her official position or any city property or resource which may be within his or her trust or perform or fail to perform his or her official duties in a manner in which he or she knows or should know with the exercise of reasonable care will result in a special privilege, benefit, or exemption for himself or herself or others. So what I would basically do is then take that and ask, does it apply to Mary? It says it applies to all employees. Prohibits use of official position or resource. In this case, she's using both her position with the city and city resources. And then, is there a privilege, a benefit to herself or others? And the benefit is she's gonna save a lot of money by getting the vendor to cut down this tree for her. And then last, she knew or should have known that there would be a special benefit. And when I tell people in the class when I'm training, it's gonna almost always be assumed that you knew or should have known. And so when I'm looking at seeking legal sufficiency, that's it. It doesn't take into account any type of mitigating circumstances. All of that comes later. And so in this case, I would find a person, or find this to be legally sufficient. And which puts us in a position to do a preliminary investigation. Now, one of the things that's come up is, and I had to learn this over the last year, but I can get a complaint and I might not have enough information. The idea is not for me to go and do an investigation to get more information before I do legal sufficiency, but if there's public information that I can gather without taking it to the level of an investigation, then I can gather that information. And I don't remember exactly where that is in administrative procedures, but it spells that out in the administrative procedures exactly types of things that I can look for. But it's not an investigation at that point. I'm just gathering more information to make a decision on whether that's legal sufficiency. And the other part of that is if, for example, I get a complaint that is not sworn. I cannot act on a complaint that's not sworn, but I can bring it to the board to consider legal sufficiency, because then the board has to self-initiate it. And the real kicker there is that you get a monthly tracking, so I don't think it's sufficient. You're going to get a report that says it isn't. If I bring it to you, then I'm thinking that it's legally sufficient, but I can't act on it. It has to be self-initiated by the board. It doesn't mean it's automatic, but then it's up to you to go through the elements and determine and weigh that against what you're seeing and determine whether or not the complaint is legally sufficient. And then at that point, we're ready to move forward with an investigation. Is there anything I left out, John, on that? Okay. Any questions or comments on that? Concerns with that? And I think one of the key things is it's really pretty black and white. You're just, at that point, you're assuming that whatever is alleged is true. And you're just looking at the elements. And it's a very low level, but perhaps that's what's in writing. That's what's in our ordinance. That's what's basically in due process for this type of process. One of the things that we know is in our bylaws right now, it says that once you find legal sufficiency, I have 20 days to notify the respondent. And it's been, I think Johnson even suggested it, but it's also been suggested that by the city that we reduce that to 5 days instead of 20 days. And the whole point is, if I'm out there doing an investigation and I'm telling people I'm investigating you, you don't even know what's going on because you haven't been notified, and that's not reasonable. What I've started doing is, especially since I can be share-based now, to send something confidential, I'll call, let them see the complaint, and so they can decide how they want to handle it. And in the meantime, I still do it through certified mail, which is what's required in our bylaws. So I'm doing it, but on paper, I'm doing it on my own, but on paper, the procedure calls for 20 days. So I want to get some feedback on that, because we can leave it 20 days or you can direct us to do something different.
Would limiting you to a 5-day window be difficult? I don't want to put you in a position where you're trying to rush through. Work. I know you're trying to do this as expeditiously as possible. It seems like leaving a little bit larger window just prevents a situation where you're trying to rush and get something done in a 5-day window. When it's understandable that you need some additional time for different cases of different complexity. I mean, really, I'm asking for your thoughts.
Yeah. We have to create a document. And the attorney does that. Then the official, it's like a cover letter stating the complaint.
Right.
And then they get the actual complaint on top of that. And that's what goes out. What's your thought on that?
Are you actually talking about
I think we could probably, I think we're 20 calendar days, and I think we could probably move it to 5 business days. We're talking about business days?
Yeah, business days.
I think the business day would be sufficient, because that would be essentially 1 week from the day of finding legal sufficiency, which I think would give us plenty of time. If we had 5, we could have an issue where we have a meeting on a Thursday, and now we're running up the following week and running out of time. So the business days, I think, would be a way to shorten the period without jamming us up based on where the calendar lies.
sorry, Kristen has it, but so right now it's 20 calendar days as
I
opposed
think
to 20
everything we have
business
is
days?
based on calendar days.
Okay.
Yes.
I would defer potentially shortening that, but what if it's the perfect storm where you're on vacation this week and you're on vacation this week? Well, now that's 10 business days and now we've actually fallen short. So I'd be careful that we don't shrink it too much. Or if you actually take 2 weeks off, well, that's working, calendar days. I mean, well, sorry, like that we're at our 20 then, if you happen to, you took 2 and then you took 2. So I don't want to limit ourselves too much. I think we should always act expeditiously and the most expeditious manner possible, but I would want to be careful pigeonholing us into now where we have to ask for forgiveness because we couldn't get it done in a certain amount of time. So that would be my only concern with shrinking it. While I'd love to say with the intent to always get it done in 5 days, I would be careful that we, again, put ourselves in a situation that we couldn't make happen.
I think we should be okay, because it's based on when we find legal sufficiency, so we would have some control on when it's starting.
I would also, I agree with Kristen, but it is also the factor of the respondent might be out of pocket for a week or something. So I would suggest splitting the difference and make it 10 business days.
I think, are we making this change because the city wants us to make this change? Is that what's driving this?
Well, it's personally, I think it's the right thing to do. Just my experience and having done this now, what I do now is nothing. Once there's insufficiency, nothing happens until that person is notified. Because they need to know before witnesses or anybody else. So the clock starts with them. And it has been awkward when you start an investigation and then the person finds out that everybody's running around saying it's me, it's me, it's me. And, it kind of creates a storm. And, because even though we work to keep it confidential, there is some conversation, and that's up to them.
No, it's shocking to think that people will start talking. Well, tell me that's not so.
But, so everybody's nervous, so the sooner the better. I mean, and you do have to think about the respondent.
Oh, 100%. Well, I tend to think Ernie's suggestion is a good one, where we recognize there is a need to get to inform the respondent as quickly as possible without putting us in a position where we inadvertently might find ourselves short on time. So why don't we change it to 10 days, 10 calendar days, 10 business days, I'm sorry. And split the difference. Any thoughts?
Motion.
I could make it very formal if you would like.
I just recognize
yeah.
motion.
Mr. Chair, I think, I need to see if Ms. Tolman, Amy, did you have a comment on this?
Yes, I just want to share just a thought on this. So both the Commission on Ethics and the Elections Commission, as you know, have a very similar sort of process to your board's process. And I just would note that statutorily for both of those entities, this time limitation of 5 days applies not, so that 5 days is the time to inform the respondent, but actually it applies even prior to the finding of probable cause. So in both of those, especially in the Elections Commission, ethics may work slightly differently. The respondent has to be advised of the complaint within 5 days of receipt of the complaint. That is 5 business days. And although that seems kind of extreme, it does make some sense in those contexts, and I'll explain. I think because I was the executive director of the Elections Commission, I was charged with determining legal sufficiency. We would immediately forward the complaint to the respondent upon receipt. And then by statute, we were required to wait 14 days and allow the respondent to respond before we could even make a determination of legal sufficiency. And that made sense because often there were many times where we would get information from a respondent that would really obviate the complaint, something that was very a misunderstanding. And I'm not saying, something that they could wiggle their way out of or something like that, but sometimes just a really basic misunderstanding, maybe a misreading of a timestamp, for example. In the Elections Commission, there's a lot of technical violations. So, it was, the timestamp actually said 12 o'clock, but we thought it said 12:01, and they have better proof that it shows the right time. And then there is no violation. So I think, that is not what your procedure is showing here. You're allowing legal sufficiency to occur and then getting the complaint out. But I think that it has a similar feel. I really think that it offers the respondents a better due process because they are given the opportunity to respond to the allegations that are made against them before the investigation goes too far down the road. And I think there's a real benefit to that in terms of efficiencies for you, for your board, for Mr. Floyd's work, for Mr. Reed's work on a case that might come before this. So I've spoken to Mr. Floyd about this before, and I just, he asked me to be prepared to explain that to you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But those are just my thoughts on what you're discussing right now.
Amy, I appreciate your input. Reality is we have a very small staff here, and so that's a concern. That I don't know what your staff is like at the FEC, but we could have a situation where we have multiple come in a short period of time. Hope that never happens, and then we've got a relatively limited number of folks who are dealing with it. And I just hate to put time limitations in place that are in case that situation ever did occur. So that's why I would suggest that we have it be 10 business days, just to leave a little bit larger window to avoid us being limited and then violating our very own procedures because of input cases coming in and limited staff.
Thank you. I think I have 3 suggestions. One is that whether we decide on business days or on calendar days, that we make an attempt to be consistent with what's already in the administrative procedures. It would be weird if everything were business days or everything were calendar days, and then we had this one weird situation where we were counting business days, if that's possible, if we can agree on a calendar day that would limit it. My other is, I think we could capture what we're trying to do by saying with all haste, but in a time not to exceed a certain number of days. And that signals that the executive director should work as expediently as possible to provide that notification. And then my third, it's unclear to me whether the 20 days that's currently in the administrative procedures is that he shall provide within 20 days, meaning that the certified mail goes out that day, or that you receive proof of service within 20 days. It's one of those things you can control, and the other one you can't. So I would just kind of put that out there for a discussion.
Oh, very good.
Another point, so the issue of the calendar versus businesses problem, I think it wouldn't be as bad in this situation because we're the ones that are keeping track of that. Everything they have to respond to is based on calendar day. I do a lot of workers' comp compliance where we have to do business and calendar for different issues. That is very confusing. I know as an attorney and then also as the layman to do it on their own. But for us, this would just be an internal clock for us. Everything that's on the outside would be calendar. But I'm not married to either one. What Ms. Toman brings up, I think she makes some very good points, and I think we have been struggling with how do we front end things so we don't have to go down a rabbit hole on every email that we receive, spending costs, spending time, and potentially embarrassing somebody who maybe doesn't need to be embarrassed. I think there's two different scenarios. If we have a sworn complaint, like I think we've had one or two, that's a little easier because that's something that's been sworn in as an actual complaint at the time we receive it. And now we can have that 5 days, like Ms. Toman mentioned. If it's an anonymous complaint that we may or may not self-initiate, well, now it's going to be a little harder for us to send it to them because then we would essentially be saying, here's something we may do something with it, we may not. We don't know. And that's where us doing these anonymous complaints makes things a little difficult. And it's different than what the state does. It's just something we need to take into consideration when we make these decisions.
You know that 20 days she's reaching, is that 20 days when we give it, is that giving us 20 days for them to receive it or for them to send it out?
Oh, I think it's,
I hope it's sent out.
I think it's sent, especially nowadays, you can't control the post office.
Mr. Floyd?
Yes.
I'll just speak to that just for a second. I think you have to do it. I think you have to put the obligation on yourself because you don't have any control over two things, the United States Postal Service and also whether or not a particular respondent may or may not accept and sign for their certified mail. I'm sure there is no one that would come before you that would do that, but we had many, many cases of people who enjoyed ducking their certified mail. And you know, our obligation was statutory, and so it concerned me greatly. It's not in the statute, but we had an internal procedure that obligation, the timing obligation of getting the complaint to a respondent was the time that it left our hands. So the 5 days was the time limit, and it was business days that we had to get that complaint out of our door, because after that, we didn't really have control. It was very frustrating, actually. So and we had to do some work on the other end to make sure that we could, especially because we couldn't even determine legal sufficiency until we knew that the respondent had received the complaint. So I would definitely advise on erring on the, you know, taking care of making sure that you can comply with your own rules, as somebody suggested.
So to make sure, just to review the process now, if we were to amend our bylaws, there'll be a second reading on it. We'll come back next meeting with proposed language for bylaws.
Yes. Yes. If you direct us to change it, we will come back with proposed language. And she makes the point on something I've actually experienced where I took a complaint, certified mail, I took it to the post office, somehow it ended up in Jacksonville. And it was more than a month before it got to the respondents. We couldn't control that.
Is this a bylaw number or?
I think this is procedure. So we won't do two readings. We can do it one.
We'll come back next meeting with a review of the proposal. Okay.
So what are you proposing? You still saying?
So motion, I think the motion. So.
Oh, can I make?
Yes.
I'd like to make a motion that we amend our procedures then, amend our procedures to change the time from 20 calendar days to 10 business days. And I think that is a fair, we're both recognizing the issues with the respondent, legitimate concerns, without putting ourselves in a position where we would inadvertently be unable to fulfill our own procedural requirements.
Motion by a second. Motion and second. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion passes.
I need to get, I wanted to quiz you on that second. Well, I want to introduce it because it makes a point about legal sufficiency. On page 2, the allegation, the local church invites City Commissioner Romar, a covered individual, to be the guest speaker for the Sunday morning service. Traditionally, the church pays guest speakers $500 per Sunday. Commissioner Romar sees this as an opportunity to connect with the community, so he accepts the invitation. On Sunday, he speaks about city initiatives and how the community can help. The church offers to pay him $500 and he declines. They insist and he accepts. Is there legal sufficiency?
I say yes, based on the elements.
Wait on that side.
Oh, no. No, I said no. Yes, but no. 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 Not legal sufficiency.
And if you just look at what's in it without reading anything extra, it doesn't say the church is a vendor or a lobbyist or a leasee. But mentally, in your mind, it doesn't hold to your personal standards. And what I usually tell class, because usually the class holds city officials to a higher standard than the ethics code actually does. And this is a good example. So I tell them that even though it doesn't violate the ethics code, it may violate public standards. So you have to consider public standards and not just the ethics code. But this is an example why it's important to walk through all the elements and not just go by what you feel.
Sure.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, because at first you're right.
Election code violation, ethics code violation there.
I went up and violation.
Mr. Floyd, I think that's why this is such a good example.
Yeah.
But if this is presented to us as board members, as a possible, item for legal sufficiency, and we said no because it doesn't meet the elements, but we don't like it, and I don't think that it meets the public standards. Do we have any ability at this point in the ordinance or in the administrative procedures to voice that? I don't think that we do.
No.
And that may be where we want to land.
Right. I mean, I think you make an important point because it's important that we stay within our parameters and that we communicate that when we're interacting with people who are looking for us to maintain compliance or make sure everybody's maintaining compliance. And they don't need to feel uncomfortable that we're going to go outside our parameters and throw something after when we don't have that authority. So in this case, there's really nothing to say. It's their judgment, it's their decision. They have to live with what they do. You can't do any more than try. Now, I will tell you, I won't name the minister, but I had a minister in class, and he was like, "Oh, I can accept the pay." I've been turning it down. So.
All right. Anything else to discuss on?
I think that's it. And so when we get legal sufficiency, that's our only option. And the only thing that would change that, and Amy, I think that's what Amy was attempting to address, we would have to change process. But if you have a scenario where somebody did something, and perhaps they weren't not aware, had good intentions, all that good stuff, and there was something mitigating that would possibly have an impact on how you would view the elements, you don't have that opportunity in the current process. If you gave them the complaint and gave them time to respond before you determined the sufficiency and there was something mitigating, then you can introduce that into making your decision on the sufficiency of that amount. If, as Amy described it, I get a complaint, before I do the sufficiency, I notify the complainant, notify the respondent and give them so many days to respond to the complaint. They may have something mitigating or something that changes. There's something that's not in the complaint that they may be able to provide that clarifies it and may change the facts as presented before it goes to legal sufficiency. And it will give them that opportunity to do that, our opportunity to do that before it goes through the whole legal sufficiency and investigation process.
Is that,
No.
that's not,
No.
I think we just changed the time.
Right.
We didn't move.
No, we changed the process.
Okay. So I think the question is whether we want to move the time to the date of receipt. Like I said before, I think it's easier if it's a sworn complaint that you receive than if it's just an email or a voicemail message with no name.
Right.
Then it's more problematic.
Can you refresh my memory on previous conversations about anonymous complaints and why we as a board are, must accept them?
We don't need to. Well, that was you recall, I think you were 1 month on the board and I was 2 weeks.
Little did I know.
I was 2 weeks on the board, I think, at the time where it was hotly debated on whether we were going to go that route. And we did go back and forth, and ultimately the board did decide that they wanted to accept anonymous complaints. But if we wanted to follow the lead of the state ethics board, we could say, no, you have to sign your name to it.
Yes, again, this opened up a whole can of worms. But I was the ethics officer at the school district, and we had this very same conversation about anonymous complaints, and came down on the side of requiring everyone who came in with a complaint to be willing to put their name to it.
Yeah.
And I'm not advocating for that with this board, but I was just curious because no wonder I don't remember. It was a month in, right? Now,
Yeah, it was very early on.
Well, who else was on the board at that point? What do you remember about that conversation?
Well, like the three said, we did decide to accept anonymous complaints and do a self-initiated complaint.
Right.
And that was so that we wouldn't be keeping people from making legitimate complaints if they were concerned. This was before there was any whistleblower protection.
Right, I was just
city.
Right.
Well,
Right. Which I think we haven't gotten to the point of we're still on 7. We haven't gotten to 8 yet. Which I think the whistleblower protection is intertwined with this conversation of anonymous complaints. Because people are concerned that they're going to be retaliated against. And we as a board have now determined, based on John's memo, that we don't have the authority to provide whistleblower protection. That I don't want to jump ahead in the agenda. Maybe now is the appropriate time to move on and discuss that. Because I do think that they are, it makes it very challenging to say you can't be anonymous if you don't have any protection and you're afraid you're going to get retaliated. Everyone disagrees with me. But I think
Sure,
that's
if
a
you want to, we
challenge.
can come back to 7B
Yeah.
And to keep this a fluid conversation.
Sure. What else?
Whistleblower.
So, number 8.
What else we need to do on 7B?
Yeah, don't wanna limit 7B.
Come back and
7B
talk
is
about
clear.
the complaint, because part of this is talking about what alternatives you have and what we may add. Such things like stipulation agreements or a letter of guidance, where that fits in the process, and what you do and don't have available to you in terms of addressing issues.
I can table this, put this onto 8 then.
So, first and foremost, I want to thank the Inspector General, his office. We had the opportunity to speak with him yesterday, it seems like weeks ago, but it was yesterday. And very helpful, very complex issue. We've had a very good relationship with the work for it. As Graham stated, we do not have the option to grant any type of protections available under the whistleblower statute. I think previously we had discussed very hypothetically, well, since everything's in Chapter 112, Part 3, does it all blend? And as I stated here, it clearly does not. Whistleblowers, even though it's a weird statute, it's not very well written, it's stuck in a weird place in the statutes, but it is very clearly only 5 sections that are within this and nothing else. It doesn't bleed into anything else. So the rest of Chapter 112, Part 3, which is ethics, which is similar to what we're doing, would not apply. So I think, going back to the 7B, you said keep the conversation fluid. I think that is why the anonymous complaint was deferred, because since we don't provide any type of protection to anyone, that is really their only way to protect their job. They want to file a complaint. As I stated here, and I think we went back and forth with the Inspector General on what if there were issues that were overlapping. Do we defer to them? Do they defer to us? Do they run concurrently? Theoretically, I think they can run concurrently, but we may not even know that they're running concurrently, because technically we're not supposed to disclose our complaints to the public because they're confidential, and their complaints are confidential. So we could be running concurrently and not be aware of it. That could be somewhat problematic, but, and we talked about some of the confidentiality issues on the whistleblowers, because we may be involved in investigation addressing issues that, unbeknownst to us, and subject to a whistleblower complaint, and now have we inadvertently violated confidentiality, which is an issue Dwight and I had yesterday after speaking to the Inspector General. And I don't know what the answer to that one is, because I think we wouldn't have any idea. No. But I think that right now with our, as I stated here, I think all we can do is our complaint. We can make people aware of what their rights are. Depending on how much we wanted to flesh out the explanation, we can explain. Whistleblower, there's really two areas where you have protected activity, reporting the violation that deals with health, safety, and welfare, and the other ones that address mismanagement, malfeasance, misfeasance, etc. And there are some areas where I think there could be an overlap. There could be a misuse of position that could also be considered malfeasance or misfeasance. So I think there is this opportunity for overlap. I think the conversation we had with the Inspector General is he said that if he knew that there were 2 investigations going, he would defer to us. Or he said he would not move forward. I don't know if he necessarily said he would defer to us, but he said he would not move forward. He wouldn't make the determination whether the person was whistleblower or not. So at that point, the person wouldn't be getting any of the whistleblower protections. As far as the ordinances are silent too, we do have in our, I think it's in our rules, that we do defer to issues that are being investigated by federal, state, and local law enforcement and the state ethics board. Those are the 4 groups that we have to defer to. We don't have anything regarding local investigative boards or the Inspector General. I think at the time we drafted it, there was no Inspector General. So that's one of the issues that we have there. But as far as, I think in short, we cannot provide protections against retaliation. As I mentioned, I think last time, if this were to get down the road and somebody were retaliated against, I think they could probably bring a claim at a later date, claim retaliation after the fact. They might prevail. But as far as the proactive protections against retaliation, that's not something we can do at this time.
And the way, and listening, and doing what I do, which is facilitate discussion, and listening, what I took away from it is that we can't use whistleblower to protect someone that comes to us. Even if we reference whistleblower protection, essentially we're turning it over to the city. One of the big issues, and Dennis is here if he wants to speak, but one of the big issues is that with whistleblower, it is forever confidential. With us, it's not confidential at the proper cost. So that's why he says he would not go forward, because there's a possibility that if we try to do something concurrent, we could compromise the whole intent of whistleblower protection. So, I view that almost like a criminal case. If we get something that's a criminal case, we sit back and let it finish. And if there's some facts that we can use, we may see if it's sustained in the court, et cetera, then we can use that to follow up. I'm not sure we can even do that in a whistleblower case because of the intent for confidentiality. But I think the most important thing to understand is that beyond what we're doing right now, we can't offer any protections for a complaint.
To clarify, this memo was just to clarify the process that we don't have this option available to us. We're not changing any policy or procedures at this point.
Correct.
Just like the concerns that the community may have, we at no point could have offered whistleblower protection. It wasn't.
I think the direction I thought I took from Mr. Payne and the board was, is there any way that our complainants could avail themselves of protections under the whistleblower statute in any possible way? Initially, my answer was no. Then I said, okay, well, I think we spin around and went in circles and tried to find a way to make it work. Theoretically, and as Dwight and Dennis probably say the same thing, theoretically, almost anything could happen theoretically. Practically is even more challenging because, like we said, the probable cause, we are required to make it public. They're required to keep it confidential, not just private, but confidential in extent. So it creates some challenges for us that I think ultimately the decision was there any way that we could fall into that protection? The answer is no. I did try to go through our two processes together to show how they work, how there's this potential for overlap and how that could be effective. That could be completely out of our hands because somebody could say, I'm going to send something over to Dwight, I'm going to send something over to Dennis. I'm not going to tell them we're talking to both, and we may never know, but that's out of our hands.
But if we did, so could we ever get a complaint to us and us basically refuse it because we thought that it should be covered under whistleblower, and because we couldn't offer that to someone, rather than the inspector general dropping it and leaving with us where it would become a public thing, could we basically do the opposite and we refuse the complaint so that he could continue to keep them protected, so that something might come out that we feel is ethical that may need to come out, but if we don't have protection for the person, is there a way to refuse it and punt it back and make or advise them? Do we have that survey or option to do something like that, if I'm making sense? Because we also, I mean, to me, the most important thing is that we don't discourage anyone from saying something. I do feel strongly that people's names be attached, but if there is some fear factor that's keeping them from telling us about something that's much bigger, that's what we're here for, is to help uncover some of that and make the public and the people of the city and the county area feel safe and protected in certain areas.
Yeah, and I think we could let Dennis speak to that if you wish, but I think it's almost gonna be a case-by-case situation, because most of what we're getting, people not even aware of whistleblower, and if they wanna go in that direction, then my reaction is to refer them to Dennis, and they would have to decide in talking to Dennis whether or not they want, and at that point, we may not ever know what happens, which is the way I think, from what I understand, that's the way it should work. Dennis, you have anything to add to that? Angie, you have anything to add to that?
Oh, wait.
No, I didn't have anything, additional to add, Dwight. I think you and John both summed up our meeting yesterday fairly well. The jurisdiction would be, the part that, there's some gray area there between, what you guys would investigate that falls within your jurisdiction and what we would investigate that falls under our jurisdiction. So, that would be the first thing that you would have to look at and whether to refer the case or not.
I would like some clarification, for verification that everything that goes through the Whistleblower Act, through the Inspector General, has to be confidential. It's my understanding that the purpose of it was primarily to prevent retribution, but I'm not sure how that follows that it has to be confidential. Are there any situations where non-confidential acts are covered through the whistleblower?
And I've had to deal with that as a city attorney for a small municipality where the complainant is telling everybody that they're bringing a complaint, and we can't even use their name. So, and I think the way the statute's written, confidentiality is very strict. It's actually a criminal violation of confidentiality. They can sign a waiver, and that is an option if we ever wanted to. I'm not saying we should, probably shouldn't, but if we ever did want to have the two offices working together, there is that option to sign a waiver, which is in 112.3188. But there's a specific waiver that I think is used. I have a form that I send out when I need it signed. But I do think that, and there is an opportunity that somebody could seek whistleblower protection. The Inspector General makes a designation, says they are not entitled to whistleblower protection. And then then they could probably go to come back to us and say, okay, wait a second, now I want to do this. They wouldn't have that protection with the whistleblower, but that's just kind of free thinking here. It's complex.
It seems to me that given our current situation, with the layering of the Inspector General and our inability to provide whistleblower protection as a result, that anonymous complaints, we have no option other than to accept anonymous. Oh, I'm sorry. Do I need to say that? Let me see. I can't remember exactly how it phrased it. It was brilliant. It was really good. It was really layering.
Did you all give me credit?
I will try to repeat myself. Essentially, that with the now layering of the Inspector General, it was not the case when we discussed this previously, that we are in a position where we must have the ability to accept anonymous complaints, because otherwise there may be really very concerning issues that people are afraid to come to they're not willing to put their name to because they are concerned about retaliation, and we have no way of protecting them from any potential retaliation. So even though I tend to believe that if you have a concern and you want to have it addressed, that you should be willing to put your name to it, we're now in an impossible situation because we don't have the ability to protect that individual from
but there is a very real chance that they could be met with some concerns at their workplace. So I'm more comfortable after this conversation with anonymous complaints than I was previously.
Thank you. So the
And that was not, by the way, Robin, that was not as eloquent as the first go round, but you know,
I thought it was good.
Thank you.
And with the layering.
All right. Yeah, that was a good
that I
one.
need. So I like them both.
Okay.
Sequel's never as good.
The second's never, it's always the first. The first one's always the best, always. Okay, I'm sorry.
So the Whistleblowers Act and the creation of the IG's office for the city is like a year old, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's great.
I think we might be in a position where we just kind of have to live with the status quo for a little while. There might be people who bring complaints, anonymous complaints to you. They claim whistleblower status. It's not really whistleblower. Being a whistleblower is very fashionable and misunderstood these days. Say what you want about the statute. It is poor. It clearly defines what you have to do in order to actually qualify for the status. And it says only the IG gets to make the call. And so it might be that you work with the IG, and I'm doing this at FSU. We try and figure out, are we meant to work together in this way? And maybe we revisit and say, you know what, all those anonymous complaints, we really think that the IG is better equipped to handle them, and they're going that way and we're not getting as many. Or the types of things that we see don't qualify for whistleblower protection because they don't fall into one of the two categories. However, they are serious. We are concerned about retaliation. And so we're going to continue to take those anonymous complaints because we need to get to the substance, regardless of whether the person's identified. I don't want to table something for a year, but we might just want to see what the numbers look like after we have a chance to talk with the IG.
I think you're correct. I think we could maintain the status quo because we talked about scenarios where there could be this overlap. I actually have an example from my municipality. A city employee had a small car, wanted to get a nice Christmas tree, so he took a city truck 4 cities over to get a real big tree and brought it back into town.
Is that wrong?
Yes. It's a misuse of position under the ethics code. Also could be deemed misfeasance under the whistleblower statute. So it's areas like that where you get a situation like, okay, whose jurisdiction is that under? And that may just be something where Dwight and Dennis go up and say, hey, what do we do? Or let the complainant drive the ship.
It's really complicated because the name of our board is Independent Ethics Board. So therefore, those that work for the city believe that we're the safer route because we're independent. And it's just been very complicated by the additional layer of the Attorney General, the Inspector General, which we all expected, frankly.
For discussion on agenda item number 8. You want to circle back on 7B now?
Yes, and I actually want to go back on 7A. And that if you're going to have an anonymous complaint, then I would recommend you consider what Amy described, which is notifying the complainant from the time you get the complaint rather than after legal sufficiency. Because what happens when you get anonymous complaints, number one, you don't know what the motive is.
All
And I've seen complaints that are very convincing, but you can't go back to them and say who's on first and who's on second, give me some leads. And even when I can go back, I found that the cooperation isn't there, which leads me more to wonder what's the motivation. Because it's easy for you to say, I need to look at this, and you need to look at that, and they're not doing that. And then I'm not talking to the respondent until after there's legal sufficiency, and there may be some information that might impact this from the beginning that I can get from that respondent before we get to legal sufficiency of that investigation. And that's what she was describing in that process. We don't have that process. We can't we automatically, we almost jump right into investigation without knowing what we're jumping into. It's not as bad for sworn complaints or for non-sworn, because we don't know who the person is. It makes sworn complaints pretty difficult. I guess silence says more.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I can see it in an elections commission scenario when it is very clearly an issue of factual mistake, or it's whether or not someone met an objective deadline, and that someone may have better evidence of what is objectively true to answer for an allegation. With our stuff, I worry that we will get essentially legal defenses that are premature and don't really help us determine actual legal sufficiency. But I understand why the alternative might also be attractive. I think that's why you get silence, is because we're struggling with which one is better.
Okay, well, we can move on.
Well, Robin's predecessor, I drove him crazy because I'm not as formal, but thank you for recognizing me. I think that what Mr. Floyd has already expressed is that you're going to put forth every effort to let the respondent know as soon as you can. And I think that's, I just don't, if we're going back to the former motion and majority of everybody voting for it, the reality is you're going to do your best to, we're not limiting you. You can take 10 business days, or you can take 1 business day. So, depending on your workload, depending on your ability. But I know, based on your conversation today, that it is in your goal is to let the respondent know as quickly as you can. If I'm misrepresenting anything, please
No, you're good.
Okay.
And that's what this board is for. We've done good. I presented it. I got an answer, so I'm good.
Okay.
The complaint process, we notified them of the complaint. We're doing an investigation, and this part is about probable cause. We're doing an investigation, then bring it back to the board. And the question is, what are your options once you receive it? And I believe still at this stage, your only option is to find probable cause or not find probable cause. And there have been, I know in the past, there have been, you might not find probable cause, but then you want to send a letter or something, a comment that says, we didn't find you guilty, but we want you to be careful about this or that. And I guess my question on that is that really within our legal framework? And I know we've done it, but is it appropriate? Because we're saying on one hand, you're not guilty of anything, but we're saying at the same time, we're giving you correction.
Right. Right.
You're right.
I think the issue is that you could see just from common sense that what was the intent? What caused this person to bring this issue forward? And that the respondent in this case is perfectly innocent, and yet there is enough there that raises, that meets the criteria that you're just looking at the 4 corners, can't read anything into it. So I think that's a challenge. And without going into anything that was discussed in the closed session, I don't want this board to be just, an avenue for a gripe session. That
you're angry about something and you're gonna come to this board and bring forward complaints that just because you're angry about something, or you're, and I don't know how we thread that needle, but I think that's kind of boils it down in layman terms of what we're facing. And unfortunately, I think that happens more often than not. The respondent is not actually, I don't think we could hold him or her to have violated any sort of ethical issue, but that the person that's bringing the complaint is angry about something. So, what do you do?
I think the issue too is that we don't have like black and white. There's nothing wrong from the outset. We find the sufficiency, the case is closed, but we find the sufficiency is something we have a question about in the investigation. So sometimes it gets really close to the edge. I think when we find no probable cause, we still want to say, you guys skated right at the edge of this.
Yeah.
Keep this in mind when you're doing this.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're saying, we're still saying you did nothing wrong by the bylaw or by the ordinance, but still, you're right, you got close to the edge. Keep this in mind when you're in the future. So I understand we have a black and white case. Those cases usually, we can dismiss them outright because there's nothing there. And now as far as the procedure, makes, the issue comes with the anonymous complaints. If you're letting the respondent know before you find legal sufficiency, why at that point? Because I understand when you have a complaint that's sworn, you make a determination outright, then you can let the respondent know. Legal sufficiency here, I'm gonna move this forward with probable cause to the board. Keep in mind, here's a chance for you to review the case, and then you can bring any further information prior to probable cause being found. But when you're letting them know before there's legal sufficiency, it's almost you conduct the investigation already at that point without even finding that there's any. That's why I'm a little concerned about that. Unsworn statements, you're letting them know about the unsworn statement before you bring it to the board for consideration for legal sufficiency.
Well, and I'll give the other part, under this process, you do have those options in penalties to do a letter of instruction and other things, but that comes after you find probable cause. And what I'm saying is that we're kind of moving ahead. We're not doing the probable cause. We're not saying there is probable cause. But we're enacting what's essentially equivalent of a penalty, because when we get to the penalties, we do have a letter of instruction where you might say you need education, or we're just going to give you a slap on the wrist. And where I used to work, it was a letter of guidance. And it just seems that you're putting that in the probable cause process in lieu of finding probable cause, even when it might be probable cause. And when, to me, it seems like it should be either you do or don't find probable cause, and it's over. You don't send them a letter or anything because you didn't find probable cause. And I mean, they're going to be more wise to the issue because they don't want to be caught in the situation to begin with. But if you do find probable cause, then you could add things like John talked about last time, stipulation agreements, where they may say, you find probable cause, they get an administrative complaint, they say, yes, I did it, I'm at the mercy of the board, can we agree to something so let's start going further? And that's where you have options to address it. And in most instances that come to after probable cause and not at probable cause. So it just seems like we're doing, I mean, it's our own version, but it just seems a little backwards because we're doing what actually happens in the penalty phase to a probable cause by giving them a letter and at the same time saying that you need it.
So in the procedure part, it says that if we don't see any violation of the ethics code has occurred, that we'll dismiss it But it does say that stating with particularity its reasons for dismissal. So do we have some leeway as to state the dismissal with the added stuff that we're kind of talking about? And it's not a slap on the wrist, but we are dismissing this because we didn't find probable cause for this, but it's walking a fine line or whatever. I mean, it's just adding an additional sentence or saying, because while you did not meet A for B327 of the statutes, you still, did this.
That makes us feel better, or put yourself on the other side of it. And you just been to the hearing. And you receive something that's official, that's public. And you just been told to do anything to that. It's almost like a deal.
Yes and no, because I do, sorry.
Yeah, you're right.
Because we're still supposed to draw this line, and earlier in the examples you gave, yes, it's your personal ethics code versus the on paper ethics code, and you would hope that the person's moral compass would know with just the simple fact, while you didn't violate this, and just ... kind of thing. You would hope, but unfortunately, not everyone's moral compass is that, and sometimes it is done with the intent to walk the tightrope line rather than this wall. Making sure we're not needing to take that run of the road. So yes, well, you would hope that there are people who are choosing to make bad choices in hopes that they don't get caught, and you might not be able to find probable cause because they didn't meet X, Y, and Z, but it was their full intent to do whatever they did. And so that's where I feel like, yes, you're saying yes, but also on the flip side, not everyone sees it like hopefully we all do, and that's why we're on this board.
I think when it comes to the order, we can specify you were not in violation of this ordinance because of the following reasons. I can specify you did not meet the following criteria and showing why we made a problem. Instead of just saying no probable cause found, have a nice statement say this is what we considered when we probable cause ABC. You came close to it, but you didn't meet this criteria, ABC, this is the reason why we found the probable cause. So I think particularity speaks to the fact that we're identifying what we're considered the probable cause and why we, our finding of fact, why we didn't find that issue. So that kind of, and not so much saying correct it, but this is why we found the probable cause. We got close to it without, a letter says, I think being the order itself. So basically the orders going forward, specify exactly what we considered and why they were not in violation of that order, of that ordinance. And that can at least let the public know what we were considering, let them know how close they were to violating, and still not be one of, still not finding nothing wrong, but you're very close to it. I think it doesn't have to be a letter. Mr. Payne.
Something to keep in mind is our mission statement that says that we're not just looking for violations of the ethics code, but for perception of violation. And that's where we might not find probable cause for actual violation, but it's clearly a perception of possibilities so that we can provide a letter of guidance or something like that without actually finding probable cause.
I really do like that. I think that, and clearly even stating, but because our mission statement is blah, 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 we're still not giving them direction. We're just saying, proceed in bold. Integrity as well, we would like you to keep that in consideration for any future endeavors. You haven't given them discipline, you haven't told them they were wrong, but you've just said, put it out there. So I really like that because it's not our opinion, this is our mission as well.
As I listen to this conversation, I keep looking down at this memorandum. At the top of it, it says Tallahassee Independent Ethics Board.
we were established to be independent of the city of Tallahassee. I have many friends, all levels of city government. And I just think we need to be very careful that we don't look like we're starting to lose that independence, make part of our title, because that's really important. And I agree with what Kristen just said, because I think it is part of our, not only in our mission statement, but our obligation to hold the city employees to a high standard. When I was working for the school district, on Monday mornings, my phone would be lit up with concerns. Generally, a parent had seen a teacher out doing something that he or she thought was inappropriate. And I would have to explain to the parent that she or he is a private citizen, and yet there is an expectation that teachers are held to a high standard in our community. And I think that's the same thing for city employees. When they sign on to this gig, they've got to recognize that they've got to be aware of their behavior. When I first got on this board, I think the first thing I said was, my standard for ethics and integrity is, would it be something that I would not want to be on the front page of the Tallahassee Democrat, regardless of whether it meets the Problem Plus standard or not? And I think that is part of our obligation, is to be a voice for the highest ethical standards for the city of Tallahassee. That's why we were established in the first place, because there was a concern across our community that that standard was not being met. So I just want us to be wary of becoming too concerned about hurting feelings, or certainly we don't want to throw somebody's reputation under the bus, but we also have to be aware that we have to have the highest expectancy of ethics for our city.
Right, and I understand that, but there's two sides to perceptions. And not only with this, we also have to make sure we're not creating perception that, and I think the way that the chairman worded is good. Is you can still do something unintended.
Oh, 100%.
And because, and John and I talk about this a lot, because what we do, it does affect other people's careers and it affects your job. So we want to make sure we're fair and objective and impartial, and that we are sending the right message. And that's all I'm saying. We just want to be careful not sending a double message.
Right, and I understand what you're saying, right? I think that we need to let our city employees know when they sign up for this, that they are going to be under a microscope. People know they work for the city of Tallahassee, and therefore, just to conduct themselves, if there's any question mark, and I agree with you too, Kristen, that, there are times where people know very well they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and yet they continue to do it. But I think most people are not. I mean, that's the exception. It's not the rule. So anyway, I just felt after listening to all this, I wanted to articulate that.
Any further discussion on this topic?
So I just want to say too, yes, and I will be quiet after this, that I don't think we're just here talking to the elected officials or the folks. We're talking to those that are responsible for helping those individuals as well. And I think it is a responsibility of those who work with maybe the more high-profile members of our city government to help them avoid putting themselves in a situation where someone's going to have a question about his or her behavior. So I think your job is providing the ethics training is critically important in that regard, to just have anyone understand that you got to be brave enough to speak up and speak to those that you work for, and to help them avoid putting themselves in a situation where there is a complaint, anonymous or not. Okay, I'm done.
Two quick things. One, we do have the option to issue advisory opinions, and that's something that we maybe need to let more members of the staff know can be done. If they have a question, they can come and ask for permission instead of forgiveness. And then second, I know we had talked, we had made a motion and voted on an amendment to the procedures. Were we actually amending it today, or was that a direction to me to bring language back?
Direction, big language back.
Okay. If I'd also like to bring, we talked about, we allow them 15 days to file a response once we contact them, but that is actually not in our procedures. We've been just doing that as a practice. When we initially adopted our procedures, we essentially didn't engage the respondent until probable cause was found or not found. And then we had the 21 days, and then we've kind of followed the Chapter 120 model for our own. I think that especially after hearing what Ms. Tillman had to say and what Dwight's contributed, Mr. Floyd, excuse me, I think that we may want to, if it's okay with the board, in addition to changing that 20 to 10, maybe add some language with that 15 days so we do bring the respondent in before the legal sufficiency. Or no, actually, it would be after legal sufficiency before probable cause.
Yes, which will change our procedures. Because right now, the last few closed sessions we've had, just been us in the session finding probable cause. We never had the respondent there participating on us finding all.
Well, we have.
We've had.
Yeah, probable cause, not a legal sufficiency.
Legal sufficiency, okay, yes.
Yeah, but in the state ethics process, they're given 15 days, and we don't have our probable cause hearing until they have those 15 days, unless they waive those 15 days. If they tell us they're good with us going sooner, we give them 15 days.
Okay, so they should just put in our procedures where we're already
Yeah,
doing.
I think it's, if you look at the bottom of page 8, top of page 9, I'd probably have to.
Okay.
I'd have to change paragraph D1 and probably add a paragraph 2. So I'll work on something for next month.
To amend our procedures to allow the grant 15 days for respondent. Do I have a motion?
So
Got a motion, a second. Second motion. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. So you'll be amending to reduce the 20 days, calendar days to 10 business days. And then allow them 15 days to respond to the children to respond to us. Okay. Any further discussion on that matter? 7. Okay, moving on to 9, public comment on non-agenda items. Do we have any requests? Any discussion regarding items for future meetings? Any discussions from the board? Any directives? Motion to adjourn. Move second. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Good conversation. Thank you.